You're listening to Harrowsmith Radio, Episode 5. Hey there, I'm your host, Wayne McPhail. This episode of Harrowsmith Radio is about extraordinary vegetables and remarkable weather and the water it brings with it. First up, we head to the East Coast, the outskirts of Halifax, Nova Scotia, to be exact. There, we meet Niki Jabbour. Niki's a best-selling gardening writer who's discovered hundreds of vegetables beyond the rank-and-file tomatoes, lettuce, and squash and other produce you might have already tucked into the soil of your garden. Ground cherries and snake gourds for everyone. Next up, we head to Perth County, where wild, wet weather has been playing merry hell with a sheep farm. All in all, an extraordinary show for your listening pleasure. And by the way, if you'd like to read Harrowsmith instead of listen to it, you can subscribe to the print version online at harrowsmithmag.com. And you can find Harrowsmith Magazine on selected newsstands across Canada. But for now, settle in for the next half hour of Harrowsmith Radio. When you read Nova Scotia gardener Niki Jabbour's book, Veggie Garden Remix, you'd be forgiven if you think Jabbour must have a garden the size of a small planet. In fact, it's just 2,000 square feet in Nova Scotia, which is not the you can grow anything here capital of Canada. But using a host of growing methods and a lot of manure, more about that later, she's managed to coax dozens and dozens of heirloom and international varieties of vegetables from the good East Coast earth. I chatted with Niki just after a May 24th weekend when memories of my own planting were fresh in my head and I was still picking the planting mix from under my nails. Here's that conversation, a conversation that changed my mind about what to put in the ground when the lettuce bolts and the peas are pooped. Tell me a bit about the garden, because when I read through your book and you're talking about like over 200 different vegetables that people can grow in their garden, my first impression was this woman must have a garden the size of Costco, right? But it's just you get a 2,000 square foot garden, right? So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, my garden has certainly changed a lot over the years. When we first bought this house 18 years ago, there was no room, no sunny space for a food garden, and I'd always had a food garden. And even when I lived in an apartment when I was in my early 20s, I gardened. So we had some dying trees in the backyard and such. So we cleaned it up and we found a beautiful sunny space, and it turned out to be this lovely, gentle, south-facing slope, which is really the perfect spot for a food garden if you can find it. So it gets full sun all day, and over the years we've just expanded it as I've had more time. So now we have about 20 raised beds. They're all either 4x8 or 4x10, 16 inches tall, made with local untreated hemlock, which is really quite rot resistant. And, I've got tunnels in there and trellises for growing vertically. I often pile up manure and compost and straw to make some free-formed beds for my nutrient hogs like the pumpkins and squash and cucumbers. I've got a 14 by 24 foot polytunnel with raised beds and smart grow bags down the middle of it as well. So anywhere I can find space, I'm going to grow. Even my back deck, which is this incredible hot sheltered microclimate, I grow all kinds of like Thai peppers and basils and tomatoes on there because, again, it's just such a hot space. So, yeah, if there's a sunny space, I'm going to grow some food.
That's great. And the kinds of vegetables you're growing are really remarkable. And I was really struck by a couple of things in the book. One, sort of some of the stuff you're suggesting is a hearkening back to heritage varieties of tomatoes and cucumbers and other things. But also, I loved the sort of international, literally, flavor of the garden. So did that start with your mother-in-law? She's from Lebanon, right? Your mom?
Yeah. My mother-in-law, yeah. So my husband's mom is from Lebanon. And as is my husband, he grew up in Lebanon. He came over when he was around 9.
Right. And that she had a snake gourd, I think it was, right? Kukuza that she was growing? Kukuza. Yeah. So tell me a bit about that, because it seems like the genesis of the garden a bit, right?
Yeah, because, I've been growing vegetables for a long time, and I've always loved to grow more traditional vegetables, but I was certainly experimenting with a lot of heirlooms and unusual varieties within some of the normal traditional quote-unquote vegetables like cucumbers. I would grow lemon cucumbers and some different varieties like that. But it was, probably 10 years ago, she was up in our garden, and I had planted snake gourds for the kids because I thought, this is really cool. They get really long. Sometimes they get 6 or 7 feet long. And so I had them on this trellis, and they were starting to hang down, maybe like a foot long at that point because it was, midsummer. They weren't too super big. And my mother-in-law had come to get some parsley and tomatoes and cucumbers, and she just kind of stopped and looked at that, and she said, "You're growing kukuza." And I was like, it's a snake gourd. I don't know. And she explained to me that she knew this as an edible type of a gourd, and they would grow them in Lebanon because everybody, in Lebanon would have a small kitchen garden, vegetables on patios and pots, and just areas where they would grow food, and just to supplement their meals pretty much almost all year round. And so we harvested a few of those beautiful little squash for her, and she took them home and cooked up a little feast for us. And I realized, wow, these kukuza are edible. They're so good. What else can I grow for her that she might, recognize from Lebanon? And we found so many cool vegetables from za'atar and cucumber melons, which are called mekti, to so many different vegetables and herbs, of course, as well. And then I started thinking, well, I really like Indian food and Japanese food and Mexican food. Maybe I can grow some of these ingredients that I either can't find locally or that are really expensive to buy. And I have to say the successes far outstrip the failures. And even here in Halifax, I grow a wide array of global vegetables in my backyard.
Yeah, it really struck me that sort of started this whole sort of exploration of the other ways that immigrants to Canada have gardened. You mentioned in the book about African keyhole gardens and hugel culture. So tell me a little bit about the kinds of ways of growing that you learned from other cultures that you brought to growing all of this variety of vegetables that are now in this garden of yours.
Yeah, I think, every culture brings different techniques and traditions and seeds and varieties and knowledge of what you can grow. And here in Halifax, we have the Common Roots Urban Farm, and they have some programs for immigrants there. There's several immigrant community gardens around the city. And if you talk to any of those folks, they all want to grow food, but they're all learning kind of in a new environment, like how to grow in Canada, in Nova Scotia, which is usually far different from where they came from. But they still try their techniques, and some of them are just amazing. Like I've talked to different gardeners from China who use raised beds as well, like I do, but they don't use wood around the outside. They free-form them, kind of changing them up every year. And they also, when they create the raised bed, they create a lip around the outside of the bed with soil, so they kind of mound the soil around the top edge of the bed, and that helps hold water. So, it doesn't drain away quite as quickly, and more of the soil, it doesn't run off, and more of the soil can absorb the water, irrigating the crops. So I've learned so many interesting techniques and ideas. And I'd really hope to include more of that in this book, but I kind of ran out of space after all the vegetables were detailed. African keyhole gardens are becoming very popular, where you have like a compost pile in the middle of the garden that then feeds the soil all around. There's some really interesting ways to grow food. I think a lot of people are really embracing the raised beds, mainly because they're tidy, they're easy, they warm up earlier in spring, they're less susceptible to weeds because you're not getting grassy weeds and other weeds coming in quite as easily. It's just an easy way to grow food when people are so busy. And I think that's letting a lot more people, and families especially, experiment with vegetable gardening. Yeah,
and it also is very accessible for people who are in wheelchairs, et cetera, right?
Yes. Absolutely. Or even, as we get older, my knees certainly don't feel quite as good as they did, 15 years ago when I was building my first little free-formed raised bed. So having, 16-inch tall raised beds in my garden is less bending and stooping for me. It's also nice to sit on the edges of the bed and have a cup of tea and just kind of enjoy the garden. So raised beds, they offer so many benefits to gardeners of all ages.
Wow. So let's talk about some of the vegetables that you're growing in the garden. So let's maybe start with tomatoes, because you're suggesting, look, if you like growing tomatoes, there's a whole bunch of other kinds of nightshade family plants that you can grow, like tomatillas and Cape gooseberries and ground cherries. I think you sort of reference them as garden berries, right? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, these are what I love to call my tomato relatives, and I certainly love tomatoes. Oh my gosh, we grow way too many tomatoes in every color, size, flavor you could possibly imagine. But then we discovered all these awesome garden berries or tomato crops, light crops, sort of like the ground cherry, and I think that would be my favorite. I'm kind of obsessed with ground cherries. They are just very easy to grow. You only need one, whereas with tomatillos you need two for cross pollination. So with ground cherries you can get away with one, and they are very productive. They don't really start until mid to late summer, and then they go until frost. But you get this bumper crop of these little tiny marble-sized golden fruits that are encased in this small papery husk. And they're called ground cherries because when they're ripe, they fall to the ground. And they taste kind of like pineapple-y, vanilla, and when they're really, really ripe, a bit like butterscotch, and they're so good. They're more like a fruit than like a vegetable, I guess, really. But we love them right out of the garden. You know, I do make a vanilla ground cherry jam, which I freeze to hide away from my family so we can have it all winter. We dip them in chocolate. We add them to muffins and loaves. We dehydrate them for granola. So, I mean, if you can grow enough, there's a million ways you can enjoy ground cherries. So I do love those. I also love tomatillos, which are not a crop I ever grew growing up here in Nova Scotia. It was totally foreign to me. When I first grew them probably 15 years ago, I was like, I don't even know what to do with these. So I had to look up recipes. And but now we grow not just your green types, but the purple tomatillos, and I'm really loving the smaller golden, like in yellow types. They're sweeter if you like them raw, like diced up on tacos or in fajitas. You can also make a really nice salsa verde with them as well. So yeah, there's a lot of diversity out there, even within some of these families, like the tomato family. So don't be shy about trying new vegetables. I think that's the mantra I want people to remember. Try something new. You might just find your new favorite family vegetable.
That's cool. So now tomatillos also can be, because we've grown some in our garden here, and we're in Hamilton, Ontario, and they can be quite almost like eggplant in the sense of that they've got that weird astringency to them, right? But you're saying some of them are quite sweet, right?
Yeah. Yes and yes. Some of them can be more astringent, and that's one of the reasons why they're often roasted in the oven for salsa verde with jalapenos and onions and garlic, and then kind of mixed all together to make a really nice salsa. But yeah, some of the yellow types, they're almost more like a sweeter fruit. And they're also smaller plants, so they get about half the size. Like there's one called Dr. Waichi, which I like to grow, an old heirloom, and it's developed, I believe, in Poland. So it's earlier to mature, so great for shorter season gardens. It's fine for containers. You still need 2 for cross-pollination. But the fruits are sweeter, and they're about half the size. But then they also ripen like about 2 to 3 weeks earlier than the green and purple types. So you have an earlier harvest and a sweeter fruit. So there's a lot of diversity out with the heirloom varieties you can find in some seed catalogs. So looking around and trying new things is a good way to discover different flavors, even within the same crops.
Cool. So let's talk about squash, because I remember when I was younger, my parents would get squash, and it was particularly around Thanksgiving or Christmas, and it was always wonderful. And these days, squash is very much that you get in the Fortino's or another grocery store is often disappointing and flavorless, right? And it's really sad. So tell me about the kinds of squash that you've discovered that if you grew them and baked them or ate them, you'd think, wow, this is fantastic squash.
There's a lot of breeding that's gone into squash, in the past few decades. And so some of the squash don't have the same flavors. Some of the newer hybrids, though, I find it's starting to kind of rebound back again. So there's a lot of new, smaller hybrids like butterscotch, which is this kind of miniature, All-America selection winning little butternut. And they're like tiny. They're like individual size, but each plant produces quite a bit. And they're disease resistant, but then they have that flavor again, which is awesome. But if you really want that old-fashioned squash flavor, you're going to have to go with some of the heirlooms. And again, any seed catalog, I mean, you find so many old heirloom varieties, like things like Shishigatani, which is a Japanese heirloom, and it's this deep, deep orange, like flesh inside the squash, and it's so delicious and sweet. Black futsu is really good. You got to love red curry, another like Asian type of squash. Really productive vines, and they're these glowing orange fruits that are just delicious, so sweet. But, I've also grown, in my first book, Be Your Own Vegetable Gardener, I talk a lot about some of the other heirlooms. There's like Musc de Provence, a French heirloom, which is just, it almost looks like a giant wheel of cheese. But that's a great one to grow if you want really deeply flavored, super sweet winter squash. And of course, once you harvest these and cure them, you've got them for like 6 to 9 months if you have a place to store them. So they're not something you have to harvest and eat right away like a summer squash. These are like investment crops. You grow them, you cure them, and then you store them and enjoy them all winter long, which is to me one of the biggest selling points of growing winter squash.
And these would be something that you would grow in your garden. You mentioned there's you sort of have a free-form compost area or manure pile. That's where you would be growing your squash, right?
Yeah, I do. I have, like, right now I've got about 8 half-rotted bales of straw that have been sitting outside my garden all winter, and so I'm going to layer those in several big piles with some of the half-rotted manure I've got up there. I usually get a load of manure for Mother's Day. It's what every girl wants. I'll mix that together and just kind of like, it's kind of like a messy-looking mixture, and you tuck the squash seedlings in it, and off they go. They go off into the woods. They go off into, like, towards my neighbor's property. They can be outside even the my deer fence. So, and they'll just do their thing. And I mean, you get all these wonderful squash. I do sometimes hand pollinate. You don't generally need to. I get quite a few bees, but I often hand pollinate my pumpkins and squash and cucumbers and cucumber melons and gourds, because if I'm up there anyway walking around and I see new female flowers open, I like to hand pollinate because it just increases my yield, and it takes me just a few seconds to do. So that's one of my tricks for increasing yield, is I do hand pollinate these types of plants.
Very cool. I'm sorry, I'm still going back to thinking about you getting a load of manure for Mother's Day. So I take it you don't see that it's a metaphor for any kind of reflection on your mothering.
No, I don't think so. I think they understand me very well, and that's how I see it. I mean, you're getting a truckload of aged manure and full of worms. My son steals them for fishing, but I love it, and he also moves it into the garden for me. But yeah, no, I think it's an awesome present. My family gets me.
Right. So I want to talk about another vegetable that you mentioned, because you talk about it in a variety of different ways in the book, is Amarant. And it wasn't something that I was familiar with. I knew it as a plant, but not necessarily in all of the forms that you talk about. So you consider it kind of superfood. So you take that apart for me a bit.
Yeah, well, Amarant is, I think, one of those superfoods we all hear about and we read about, and people are buying Amarant, you know, as a grain or as a pseudo grain, really, you know, tucking it into, like, breads, and, you know, it's ground up and using it as, like, a flour. And, you know, I grow lots of Amarant in my garden, and sometimes, you know, our season is long and dry enough in the fall that I can mature some of those seeds, but I never grow Amarant for that purpose, because here in Nova Scotia, it generally doesn't happen for me. But Amarant is also this incredible food that as a green. So I kind of use it like I would spinach, cooked, you know, in dishes, whether it's my spinach artichoke dip. I'll use Amarant all summer long. Or, you know, I'll use it raw in salads like spinach as well. You know, it's the great thing, I guess, about it is the fact that it's heat tolerant. So, you know, yes, you can grow great greens like spinach and lettuce and arugula in spring or in fall and winter, but in summer, most of these bolt. They don't like the heat, whereas Amarant thrives in the heat. So I will grow a lot of these different types of Amarants, and, you know, they come up nice and thickly, and I'll just keep shearing them back with, like, head shears, which thickens up the plants even more, gives me a bigger harvest, and then I just keep harvesting those shearings for using in my kitchen, whether, again, raw or cooked. So some of them have, like, purpley leaves, some have bright green leaves, some are, you know, tricolored, like Amaranth tricolor, which is also called callaloo, and used, I mean, in a lot of Jamaican cooking and African cooking. Just really healthy, very easy to grow, bothered by few pests and diseases. And then some of them, late summer, fall, will produce tassels, very gorgeous, like dramatic flower heads, which I cut, you know, for arranging in my house, some cut flowers, because I know, again, that I don't have enough time to mature those little seeds, the pseudograins, so, but we use them as a cut flower too. So it's a plant that really gives and gives, and adds a lot of drama to the garden.
That's excellent. So I'm going to try that in our garden this year, actually. Thank you. Now let's
good. You might, if you ever, sorry, I should just mention Richter Seeds. They have lots of great varieties if you ever shop there.
Yeah, and I want to talk about where to get seeds in a minute. But let's just finish off on leafy greens for a bit, because one of the things that I was really taken with in the book was your discussion of your opportunity to grow other kinds of lettuces or leafy greens. And there's things like you mentioned mache, Tokyo Bacan, Celtis. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I love lettuce. I gotta say, it's it's one of the first things I ever learned to grow was growing, simple lettuces like leaf lettuce, black-seeded Simpson, some of the salad bowl type lettuces, and I've still got loads in my garden right now. I'm harvesting like crazy. But, again, there's a lot of variety out there, and sometimes it's nice to explore different kinds of foods that you can use in the same way. So Tokyo Bacana, you mentioned, that is an open, loose-leaf type of Chinese cabbage, but it looks very much like a lime green leafy lettuce, like black-seeded Simpson, except it's actually more cold tolerant, where it is a cabbage family vegetable. So I can actually put it in my cold frames or in my garden earlier in spring, or harvest it later into autumn, or even in my polytunnel or cold frames for winter harvesting, because again, it's more cold tolerant. And then, unlike lettuce, when this plant finally bolts and produces the flower stalk, the flower buds themselves, because again, it's a cabbage family plant, it looks like a little broccoli head. So we harvest those and eat them. Or if you let them open into the little yellow flowers, the pollinators love them if you happen to do that in late spring or early summer. So you get all this pollinators and bees coming to your food garden. Or you can eat the flowers too. You can pick off those little yellow flowers, sprinkle them on your salads and your sandwiches. So unlike lettuce, it has more than one edible part. You get the leaves, which are delicious, and you get the flower buds like baby broccolis, and then you get the edible flowers. So there's a lot of different plants that you can use like lettuce, but that maybe have added value, if I may. Like mosh, for example. It is a traditional European green. It has a mild flavor. It's very much like lettuce, but it's so cold tolerant. I can grow it in my winter garden in Halifax without any protection, and we harvest it all winter long. The only problem is it gets covered with 2 feet of snow. So I do grow it in cold frames and polytunnels, but it's ridiculously cold tolerant, something that lettuce is not. There are more hardy varieties of winter lettuces, but they don't perform the way that mosh would. So, if you're thinking of extending your season, or you want a plant that has more than one edible part just to give you more food over time, then you might want to look into some of these lettuce-like crops.
Cool. Thank you. Now, you've talked about stuff like Amarant that grows later in the summer. So we're recording this at the end of May. So a lot of people last week or maybe even this week are still putting their garden in, but it's still not too late to explore some of these different varieties in this season, right?
Oh, absolutely. Now, people have already started asking me if they've already missed the boat on planting the garden. I'm like, we're getting frost tonight. So definitely not. The sky is the limit at this point of the season. And even if people ask me in early September, oh my gosh, I totally missed the boat on this season, I'd be like, no, you didn't. You can still plant baby beets now. You can still plant radishes. You can still plant some daikons. You can still plant lettuce and spinach and arugula and a lot of these Asian greens, mustards, mizunas. There's hard to find a time of the year when you've actually missed the boat. There's always vegetables that can be seeded or planted. And I also succession plant, of course. So yes, I'm going to be planting my cucumbers in the next couple days and my tomatoes, but then I'm going to plant more cucumbers in a month, because that's going to take me, from that first crop, when that ends, probably in mid to late August, I will then have fresh cucumbers from late August into, late September, early October. So you can still succession plant as well. That just allows you to always have that high-quality harvest. That's probably a totally different book on succession planting. But yeah, you can certainly, you haven't missed anything at this point. The sky's the limit. And you can go to the grocery store and pick up some lemongrass stalks. Try to look for ones with little bits of roots on them. Stick them in a glass of water for a week. They're going to grow more roots, and plant them in a container or your garden. Or many garden centers now carry a lot of these unique vegetables. I was at a couple of garden centers yesterday, and I picked up ground cherries. I picked up tomatillos. I picked up, they even make cucamelons, which I didn't need because I have 40 right now on my deck. But a lot of the garden centers have responded to the fact that, people want to grow these cool things. And so you're finding them, much more frequently at your local nurseries and garden centers.
So where else besides local garden centers could people go to get some of these seeds? You mentioned a couple of places. Can you just give a quick overview of where you would look for this, or where people should look for these kinds of heritage seeds and international varieties?
Yeah, you know what? Years ago when I first started doing this, it was really hard to source a lot of these plants. Now it's so easy. My local garden center sells a lot of the seeds on their seed racks, like the Halifax Seed Company, but also places, like Richter's Herbs in Ontario sells so many of these awesome varieties of herbs and some of the global vegetables. They sell lots of those, and you can get them as plants, which saves you time, or as seeds. Heirloom seed companies here in Nova Scotia, Annapolis Seeds, Hope Seeds, in California, Baker Creek Heirloom Seeds is a huge, probably the world's largest supplier of heirloom seeds. Johnny Seeds in Maine is a great supplier as well. Fedco. Most seed companies now are going to carry a wide selection of these vegetables, so they're much easier to find than they would have been, even just a few years ago.
Well, thanks very much. And thanks very much for experimenting and discovering all of these ways of growing and making use of all these heritage vegetables and wonderful multicultural vegetables. And thanks for taking the time to talk to me. I'll let you go back to your manure pile, but I really appreciate the time you took today.
Well, thank you so much, Wynn. I appreciate you including this. I mean, again, as writers, this is so, I appreciate it so much because, this is really helped spread the word. And yeah, so thanks for taking the time to chat. I appreciate it.
That was Niki Jabbour, as happy as a mum in pig poop in Halifax, Nova Scotia. The theme of the summer issue of Harrowsmith magazine is water. Sarah Loten has a love-hate relationship with that vital element. Extreme weather has caused water to flood and freeze her fields and pipes, sink her tractor, and make her wonder what's coming next from season after season. She wrote about wicked, necessary water in the magazine and chatted with me from her farm in Lanark County. I think that folks who don't farm, and that's most of us in Canada, I think, have a kind of idealistic view of water on a farm, that it's a good thing, that rain is good for the crops and water, allows, in your case, the sheep to drink. But in your essay, it's really clear that you have a much more complicated relationship with water, right?
Well, I think for anybody who farms, water is essential, but it's just too much of a good thing is too much of a good thing. I mean, as we saw in events in agriculture around the world this past winter, especially in places like Australia and the U.S. as well, you can very, very quickly get overwhelmed.
So let's talk a little bit about the unsafe aspect of water for you as a farmer.
All it takes is a really huge downpour to create almost like this temporary, rivers. In our part of the world in Ontario, we can get these huge snow loads that will cause buildings coming down. Freezing pipes and freezing water lines is just a nightmare for us. Put some of our equipment out of commission pretty quickly.
You mentioned in the piece that your son, I think, almost lost a tractor in the mud.
Yeah, and that was a little bit of an expensive day. Yeah, we have swales and ditches and things to kind of to channel water basically in a way that it's safe. But I mean, over time, that almost looks like very much a part of the natural landscape. So he drove our tractor into what should have been a ditch, but it was now looked quite firm because it was covered over with soil and grass, but it was still functioning very much as a ditch thing. And then, water got up to, he could hardly get out of the tractor. Actually, it was so high up.
So have you seen more examples of extreme weather lately on your farm?
This past winter was just ridiculous with the yo-yoing of the weather, going up and down, going 10 above, and then a few days later dropping down to minus 20 and in the middle of winter. So normally we don't even have that kind of fluctuation of temperature, and literally having rain events that were and thunder showers in the middle of January at one point. So you have this constant freezing, thawing going on. I don't think any machine or landscape or plants handle that very well, right? So this year, for instance, an example of the effects of that water damage is we get ice pans forming on fields in those kind of conditions, which basically means it's a big puddle that gets melted out in the middle of the winter, and then it all freezes over, and all plants need oxygen. And when it gets trapped underneath that ice pan, perennial plants like, say, alfalfa or even a lot of the grasses just can't survive. They just can't get the oxygen they need to survive through the winter.
Are you concerned that it's going to get worse?
Yeah, like everybody else, I guess. Personally, from just observation, I see more extreme swings. And it does affect us directly, in a very, very practical, everyday kind of way.
So what are you doing to mitigate that concern?
You kind of do what you can, just in terms of just having equipment. I mean, it often uses more resources, if nothing else, right? So things like the water lines breaking, they just can't handle those kind of extremes. So then we have to start putting in things like more electrical heat lines and to start using more insulation that we didn't have to do before. Mostly it comes in the form of something mechanical, though, that you have to do to for flooding situations, you have to use more pumping mechanisms somehow to kind of pump water out.
It's almost like when I was reading your piece, and I'm exaggerating, but it felt this way when I was reading the piece, that water used to be a friend, and now it seems like it's in some ways starting to become a bit of an enemy.
I wouldn't trade places with some of the people who are dealing with drought conditions. And drought conditions, frankly, last summer we did have drought conditions through almost the entire growing season. It was drought, and then suddenly in the fall we had huge amounts of rain that caused fungal problems in a lot of the crops, and a lot of the crops had to be written off because the fungal rates were too high. And that's directly related to water. So it's all in the balance and the mix and the moderation, right? If you get torrential rainfalls all night long that falls on top of a snowpack that had 60 centimeters of snow. And then it's suddenly the next day it's like sunny and it's like, 10, 12 degrees in February. You just have a huge mess on your hands. I don't know how you can really ever prepare for something like that, right? You just kind of like grapple with it.
So what would you suggest to farmers that have farms like you have, or other farmers that have to deal with water issues? What would your advice be to them?
I think our farming benefits from good drainage patterns so that even when those severe events occur, there's a way for the water to get away in a way that's beneficial to all involved, animals, plants, people, equipment. Unfortunately, that takes money and investment. I also think we have made our lambing periods later and later so that it is predictable that we will typically have more rain flow between the melt and then the rain. In the forecast itself, it's always higher. Sort of water levels will be high on our land between sort of mid-March to end of April. So we used to always lamb during those periods. Now we try to avoid it mostly and hit the May period because even if it's wetter, it's less wet usually and less extreme in events. And it doesn't sort of have that collision of snow melt with rainwater. You can work with nature that way. And I think part of it is also not trying to fight against what nature will typically offer, plus being prepared for the edge of the envelope to be pushed that much further by some of these extreme events.
Well, thank you very much for sharing that advice, and thanks for writing the story. As I said, for somebody who doesn't farm, it was really insightful to see the challenges you're facing and increasingly facing with the change in extreme weather we're seeing. So good luck with your water this year.
Okay, thank you very much.
That was Sarah Loten, who has pulled her tractor out of the mud and is still on speaking terms with her son. So here we are at the end of this episode of Harrowsmith Radio. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider subscribing to this podcast on Apple iTunes or in your favorite podcast player. And please tell your friends and family. Got feedback? We'd love to hear it. You can email us at letters@harrowsmithmag.com. That URL, harrowsmithmag.com, is also where you can order subscriptions online. And you can find Harrowsmith Magazine on selected newsstands across Canada. Until next time, for Harrowsmith Radio, I'm Wayne McPhail. And also, until next time, remember these 4 words: make, grow, sustain, share. Tune in for the next episode of Harrowsmith Radio.